Boston has always been a city built on pride, tradition, and the belief that neighbors look out for each other. But on one cold October morning in 1990, that belief shattered. A simple Ford Tempo sat forgotten in a parking lot near South Station, its doors locked, its interior wiped clean, its presence so out of place that even officers paused when they saw it. Cars don't end up there by accident. People don't go missing without a sound. And yet, no one had seen anything. No one had heard a cry. No one stepped forward. Lena Wexford should have been safe. She was young, determined, and heading home after a long night caring for sick children. She had plans. She had purpose. She had people who needed her. But from the moment she walked out of Boston City Hospital at around 1:15 a.m., the world never saw her alive again. That simple truth still sparks anger decades later. How could someone move through a city full of people and erase a woman's path so completely? How does a life vanish between one street and the next? And why did it take 25 years, 25 long, painful years to uncover the clue that finally exposed the truth? Before we go any further, let me ask you something. Have you ever sensed something was wrong long before anyone else noticed? That feeling, the sudden tension in your chest, the shift in your breathing, that's the exact feeling Lena's loved ones felt that day. And they were right. If danger can hide this quietly, subscribe so you're never blindsided. Not subscribing? Then drop a comment and explain why you'd risk staying unprepared. Before we move on, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. If you enjoy stories like this, hit like, subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and share this video with someone who'd appreciate it. The moment Lena didn't show up for her shift later that day, people felt it in their gut. This wasn't someone who forgot, someone who overslept, someone who let responsibility slip. She was disciplined in a way that left no room for uncertainty. When hours passed without a call, the sense of dread grew into something sharp. Her co-workers reported her absence, hoping it was a misunderstanding. But deep down, everyone understood something terrible had happened. Her parents drove in from Worcester the second they were notified. They didn't wait. They didn't hesitate. They didn't tell themselves she was probably fine. A mother doesn't feel a jolt of fear like that for no reason. A father doesn't grip the steering wheel that hard unless he knows he might be heading toward the worst day of his life. But when they unlocked her apartment, the shock cut even deeper. Her space wasn't chaotic or ransacked. It looked like a morning paused halfway through. A mug still cooling on the counter. A library book resting open, mid-chapter. A jacket draped over a chair as if she'd returned to grab it within minutes. There was no struggle, no warning. Just absence, and the quiet kind that hurts in a way nothing else does. As detectives examined what little they had, the same question echoed through every room. How does someone vanish between leaving work and reaching their own front door? Boston felt smaller that day, tighter, uncomfortable in a way people still remember. Because this wasn't a story about a stranger in a distant alley. This was about a young woman who lived among them, walked the same streets, trusted the same environment, and was taken before dawn without a single scream heard. Word of Lena's disappearance spread fast, not because of rumors or sensational headlines, but because people instantly felt the wrongness of it. She wasn't the type to wander off or vanish out of frustration. She didn't leave clues, hints, or troubled conversations behind. Her life was stable, purposeful, and filled with direction. So when the news reached the streets, neighborhoods, and break rooms across Boston, the reaction wasn't confusion, it was anger. How could someone take a woman who had devoted herself to saving lives? How could anyone drag her into the shadows while the city slept? The frustration grew heavier by the hour, especially when the only concrete lead detectives had was that abandoned Ford Tempo. Clean, lifeless, offering nothing. Detectives tried to trace her steps from the hospital to her car, but the path gave them nothing. No witness remembered seeing her. No camera captured her. The streets that should have held answers stayed silent. And that silence hit harder than any loud, chaotic crime scene ever could. It made people furious. Every minute that passed widened the gap between what happened and what could still be found. The cold morning air turned sharper as officers questioned commuters around South Station. Some paused, worried. Others shook their heads and hurried off, pretending everything was normal. But nothing was normal. Not anymore. Somewhere between 1:15 a.m. and sunrise, something tore a hole through this community and the sense of safety it held on to. Lena wasn't reckless. She wasn't careless. Whatever happened to her came fast, came quietly, and came from someone who understood exactly how to leave no trace. The question that haunted Boston then and still haunts it today is painfully simple. Who had the audacity to take her in the dead of night? Detectives stood over Lena's abandoned car with a growing sense of frustration that bordered on rage. A vehicle should tell a story. A smudge on the window, a fingerprint on the door handle, a discarded receipt, a scrap of fabric. But this one offered nothing. Whoever left it there wanted silence. They wanted confusion, and they wanted the people searching for Lena to question everything. What cut deepest was how calm the scene looked. A car left neatly in a row of long-term parking, as if its owner had simply stepped inside the station for a routine trip. But everyone knew that wasn't true. Lena had no plans to travel, no luggage, no reason to come here. This wasn't a choice she made, it was a move someone else forced. Boston commuters walked past the vehicle all morning, unaware that a life had been stolen before sunrise. Some later said they felt uneasy without knowing why. Others admitted they noticed the car but dismissed it. That's how bold the person responsible was, confident enough to leave the most important clue in plain sight, surrounded by people. As investigators searched the area, one thought kept looping in their minds. Someone out there knew how to remove a person from their routine without leaving a trace. Someone patient, someone practiced, someone who studied her patterns. And that idea made people furious because it meant Lena didn't cross paths with a random threat. She crossed paths with someone who was prepared. By the end of that day, the city wasn't just worried, it was shaken. A woman vanished between her workplace and her front door, and all Boston had to hold on to was a car that looked as if it had been placed there on purpose. The question no one could escape was this: how many clues were wiped away before anyone even noticed she was missing? As the hours passed, pressure tightened around the investigation. Detectives knew the first 24 hours decide everything, and they were already losing ground. Every step they took felt like chasing a shadow that stayed one move ahead. Lena's friends, co-workers, and family flooded the station with questions no one could answer. Her mother clutched Lena's photo with trembling hands, demanding updates every few minutes. Her father paced in silence, jaw clenched, eyes burning with the kind of fear that comes from knowing something is terribly wrong. Back at the hospital, nurses gathered in small clusters, talking in hushed tones, refusing to accept what their hearts already knew. They replayed her last shift over and over, searching for anything, any glance, any word, any sign that could explain how a woman they saw every day simply never made it home. The guilt lingered in the air. Everyone wondered if they had missed something that could have saved her. Meanwhile, commuters and locals across Boston listened to early whispers of the case with rising frustration. People felt unsafe. They felt betrayed by the illusion of routine. A young woman walked out of her workplace and vanished without noise, without warning, without a chance to defend herself. The anger grew because if this could happen to Lena, someone responsible, careful, and well-liked, then it meant no one was truly shielded. Detectives pressed harder, interviewing anyone who might have crossed her path. Some offered theories, some shrugged, some were too frightened to speak openly. But not a single person had seen Lena after she left the hospital doors. That fact gnawed at the investigation from the very beginning. And as night fell again, the question that kept investigators awake was the one that still haunts this story today. How does a woman vanish between one heartbeat and the next? Before Lena's disappearance became headlines, before investigators chased leads across the city, she was simply a young woman fighting every day to build a future she believed in. Her life was marked by discipline that most people twice her age struggled to maintain. She woke before sunrise, studied between shifts, and pushed herself not because anyone expected her to, but because she had a vision of what she wanted her life to become. Co-workers admired her focus. She never cut corners, never complained, never let exhaustion dictate her effort. Even after a demanding shift, she often stayed late to check on a child who needed extra comfort or to help a colleague who was overwhelmed. She carried a quiet strength, one of those people whose presence made stressful rooms calmer, and whose smile eased a parent's fear in an instant. Her apartment reflected that same determination. Notes reminding her of weekly goals were pinned neatly on her wall. A calendar marked with deadlines showed how serious she was about earning her advanced degree. She didn't waste time. She didn't drift. She moved with purpose. What makes her story hit even harder is how ordinary her final day began. She woke up, got ready, and headed to Boston City Hospital like she always did. To her, it was just another night of helping children breathe easier and parents sleep with a little less fear. She had no idea the path she walked every day without hesitation, without concern, would betray her. When you understand how driven she was, how much she still planned to accomplish, the pain of what happened becomes almost unbearable. This wasn't just a case. It was a life on the edge of becoming something remarkable, until someone stole it from her before the sun came up. Lena's work in the pediatric ward was more than a job. It was the place where her heart lived. Children trusted her instantly. Parents felt relief the moment she stepped into the room. Even doctors admitted they depended on her steady hands and clear mind during long nights when fatigue made everything harder. She had a way of speaking to children that cut through fear. She'd kneel down, meet their eyes, and make them believe they were strong enough to get through anything. Parents later said that Lena didn't just care for their children, she carried part of their burden, the part that kept them awake at night. That's why her absence shook everyone so deeply. Someone like her wasn't supposed to disappear. Someone like her was needed. On the night she vanished, she handled double the workload, yet she never lost pace. She adjusted 4 lines, comforted crying toddlers, and reassured anxious parents who clung to hope. Even in the final hour of her shift, co-workers said she still carried that same calm, steady presence. She always had no signs of fear, no signs of trouble, no hint that she was heading toward danger. The pediatric ward remembered her laughter echoing down the hall, the worn-out sneakers she wore for long shifts, the way she'd tuck loose hair behind her ear whenever she was concentrating. These details mattered to the people who loved her, because they were the pieces of her life that made her real, not a name in a case file, not a tragic headline, but a young woman who gave everything she had to people who needed her most. Her dedication didn't go unnoticed, and it didn't fade with time. It made her disappearance 10 times harder to accept, because the world lost someone who spent every day giving pieces of herself to help others hold on. Lena didn't live by chance, she lived by intention. Her 5-year plan wasn't a vague dream scribbled on a notebook page. It was detailed, specific, and full of milestones she pushed herself to reach. She planned to finish her advanced nursing degree, transition into pediatric trauma care, and eventually join a specialized medical outreach program that traveled to underserved communities. She wanted her work to matter on a larger scale. She wanted her life to lift others. Friends said that whenever Lena spoke about her future, her eyes lit up with determination. She wasn't waiting for life to hand her opportunity, she was building it piece by piece. She kept track of classes, certification deadlines, and financial goals with a seriousness that made people admire her even more. Her ambition wasn't loud or boastful, it was steady, the kind of drive that came from a heart anchored in purpose. That's why losing her hit like a punch to the chest. She wasn't drifting through life, hoping things would work out. She was climbing, step by step, toward a future she earned. And she was doing it without shortcuts, without excuses, and without slowing down. The tragedy becomes even harder to accept when you consider how close she was to everything she worked for. She had just finished a difficult round of coursework. She was already discussing future rotations with her supervisors. She was on the brink of stepping into the version of herself she'd been shaping for years. All of that momentum, all of that effort, stopped the moment someone intercepted her path. Her goals, her plans, her hard-won progress. None of it protected her from what happened that night. It's painful to think that a woman so focused on building her future never got the chance to see it unfold. On the night she disappeared, Lena walked through the hospital halls with the same steady focus she carried every shift. She reviewed charts, offered last-minute comfort to nervous parents, and checked on children who had grown attached to her gentle voice. A few co-workers later said she looked tired, but not overwhelmed. Exhaustion came with the job, and Lena handled it better than most. Shortly before 1:15 a.m., she finished her final tasks and signed out. She grabbed her jacket, pushed open the heavy hospital doors, and stepped into the cold Boston air. No cameras captured her next steps. No witnesses remembered seeing her cross the street. The walk from the hospital to her car wasn't long, yet that stretch of pavement became the single most important piece of her final hours, and the one that held no answers. There's something deeply unsettling about the idea that a person can walk out of a secure, well-lit building and vanish before reaching their own vehicle. It forces a question most people don't want to ask. What do you think happened after she left the hospital? Was someone waiting? Was it coincidence? Or did someone watch her long enough to know exactly when she'd be alone? Lena's final sighting was heartbreakingly ordinary, a woman finishing her shift, heading toward her next day, unaware she would never reach it. That last moment, simple as it was, carries a weight that her family still feels decades later. Stories like this vanish fast. Subscribe so you don't miss the truth. If you still won't subscribe, comment why truth doesn't matter to you. When Lena failed to arrive for her next shift, her supervisor felt tension settle in her chest. Lena wasn't the type to ignore responsibility, and everyone knew it. After calling her repeatedly with no answer, the supervisor made the decision that changed everything. She alerted Lena's parents. Within minutes, her family was on the road from Worcester, traveling with a mix of fear, anger, and hope that somehow they were overreacting. What they found when they reached her apartment only made their fear sharper. The door was locked, the way Lena always left it. Nothing appeared broken. Nothing looked forced. Her parents paused in the hallway, praying she'd be inside, asleep, unaware of the panic she had caused. But deep down, they knew better. When the door finally opened, the silence inside hit harder than any scream could have. Her apartment wasn't chaotic. It wasn't disturbed. It looked exactly as she would have left it on any normal day, which only made the situation worse. A half-finished mug sat on the counter, the surface still stained from the coffee she didn't finish. A library book lay open on her table, marked by the page she intended to continue. A jacket hung neatly over the back of a chair, as if she planned to return home, grab it, and head out again. Her routine lived in that space, her calm, her order, her focus. But she wasn't there. Detectives scanned the room with growing frustration. Nothing was out of place, and yet everything was wrong. Lena's bag, ID, cards, and clothing were untouched. Her keys were missing. Her car wasn't outside, and her nurse's watch, the one she never worked without, was nowhere to be found. A life paused, a future interrupted, and no hint of where she went next. Detectives moved slowly through Lena's apartment, trying to make sense of a scene that felt wrong in a way they couldn't immediately explain. The air inside still held the faint smell of her coffee, as if she'd stepped out only moments earlier. A thin band of morning light slipped through the curtains, brushing across the table where her open book rested. Nothing suggested panic. Nothing hinted at a struggle. It was the kind of stillness that made the investigators uneasy, because it suggested someone had taken great care to avoid leaving traces. Her parents stood in the doorway, their faces tight with confusion and fear. They scanned the room as if expecting Lena to appear and explain everything: a misunderstanding, a delay, anything that didn't lead to the nightmare they were now living. But every silent corner of the apartment reminded them she wasn't there. Her routines were frozen in place, but she was gone. Officers checked her bedroom next. The bed was made. Her work bag sat neatly on the floor. The clothes she planned to wear the next day were folded with intention. These weren't the habits of someone planning to leave. These were the habits of someone expecting to come home after a long shift. One detail captured their attention immediately. Her shoes were by the door, lined up exactly the way she always placed them before slipping into her comfortable work shoes. But the nurse's watch, she always wore the indigo-faced one her grandfather gave her, was missing. That watch had sentimental value. Leaving it behind was unthinkable. Detectives exchanged glances. People don't disappear from lives this orderly without something forcing them off their path. And everything in this room pointed to one chilling conclusion: Lena never made it home, and whoever stopped her knew exactly what they were doing. Detectives stepped back to reevaluate the room, searching for anything, no matter how small, that could explain how Lena vanished without leaving a trace. The silence pressed against them. A home that should have held the warmth of someone returning after a long shift instead felt suspended in a moment that would never restart. One of the officers noted the absence of her car keys and immediately radioed in to check whether her Ford Tempo was still parked near her apartment. When the report came back that the vehicle wasn't there, the tension in the room tightened. Lena wasn't the type to lend her car casually or park it blocks away. If the car was gone, it meant one thing. Someone moved it. Her parents hovered near the doorway, forcing themselves to stand still as the detectives worked. The ache in their expressions said everything. They looked around the apartment for signs of panic, a note, anything that would show Lena had some control over whatever happened, but nothing pointed in that direction. Every detail in the space spoke of someone who expected to come back, someone who didn't see danger coming. The missing watch stood out the most. It wasn't expensive, it wasn't flashy. But it mattered deeply to Lena, a gift from her grandfather, worn on every shift, a reminder of the person who encouraged her to chase her career. Her mother's voice cracked when she mentioned it. She never left without it. That one statement hit the detectives harder than any evidence so far. They knew then that whoever took Lena didn't just interrupt her life, they took something meaningful, something personal. And that kind of choice said far more than any fingerprint ever could. But in a room that looked untouched, the biggest clue was the one no one had noticed yet. And it would stay hidden for years. The longer detectives stayed inside Lena's apartment, the more the frustration grew. Everything looked orderly, calm, untouched, but that unnatural stillness carried a weight none of them could ignore. It was the kind of quiet that suggested answers were buried somewhere they couldn't yet reach. Every detail pointed toward a young woman who planned to come home, complete her tasks, and continue her life exactly as she always did. Yet she hadn't stepped foot inside since leaving for work the night before. One detective opened the refrigerator, hoping to find some clue in her daily habits. Groceries were arranged neatly, nothing spoiled, nothing out of place. Another checked her study table. Notes, schedules, medical texts, all arranged with intention. Her world was steady, structured, and full of purpose. And standing in the center of that steady world, they felt the ache of knowing someone had ripped her out of it without warning. Her father moved toward her bedroom doorway, his hands shaking. He didn't cross the threshold. He just stared inside, as if trying to memorize every detail in case he lost access to the space forever. Her mother clutched her chest, whispering prayers under her breath. The detectives tried to keep working, but the raw pain surrounding them made the room feel smaller, heavier. Then came the moment that shifted their understanding completely. A neighbor confirmed Lena never returned home that morning. That simple statement hit the team like a blow. Whatever happened to her occurred between the hospital exit and her car, a painfully short distance. Yet in that space, someone managed to intercept her and erase any sign of the encounter. As they wrapped up their initial sweep, one thought lingered among them, unspoken but unmistakable. This wasn't the scene of a woman who left. It was the scene of a woman who was stopped. Detective Elias Thorne arrived at Lena's apartment with the kind of quiet intensity that made people pay attention without him ever raising his voice. He wasn't known for dramatic entrances or flashy statements. He was known for something far more effective, a mind that refused to ignore details others walked right past. When he stepped inside Lena's apartment, he didn't see a tidy home. He saw a life disrupted with no explanation, and that alone ignited something fierce in him. Thorne had worked countless cases, but something about this one struck a nerve immediately. Maybe it was the stillness of the apartment, maybe it was the look on Lena's parents' faces, or maybe it was the way every object in the room insisted she had planned to return. Whatever it was, he felt a shift inside him, the kind that told him this wasn't going to be simple, and he couldn't afford to approach it like just another missing person report. As he listened to the early timeline, something didn't sit right. Lena wasn't someone who left her responsibilities hanging. She wasn't someone who walked away from a shift without warning. The idea of her running off or deciding to disappear didn't match anything her friends, family, or co-workers told him. And Thorne trusted patterns. When someone breaks theirs, there's always a reason, but Lena's life showed no cracks, no escape route, no sign she planned anything other than coming home. Thorne stood near the kitchen counter, staring at the half-finished mug, thinking quietly. Have you ever trusted your gut even when the facts didn't? That was the thought running through his mind as he scanned the space. His instincts were loud, even if the evidence wasn't. Something about this disappearance felt wrong, not chaotic, not desperate, controlled. And control meant someone else was involved. Thorne began reviewing the earliest details of Lena's last known movements, and it didn't take him long to dismiss the idea that she walked away by choice. Everything he examined pointed to a young woman who intended to return home after her shift. Nothing in her life hinted at a sudden break from reality. No recent conflict, no hidden crisis. People who choose to disappear leave traces of their struggle arguments, unusual purchases, sudden withdrawals, signs of isolation. Lena left none of that behind. He studied her work logs, the time she clocked out, the co-worker she spoke to, and the distance she would have walked to reach her car. It wasn't far. A short path lit by street lamps, a route she took countless times. If she had even a moment of hesitation or fear that night, no one noticed. Her behavior showed certainty, not avoidance. The more Thorne learned, the angrier he became. A woman like Lena didn't vanish into the night because she wanted space. She didn't vanish because she was overwhelmed. She didn't vanish because she was careless. Someone cut into her routine with precision, and he could feel it in every detail he reviewed. It was almost as if the person responsible knew exactly how to intercept her without attracting attention. Thorne spread out her schedule on the table, tracing her steps from the hospital doors to the point she should have reached her car. He placed markers along the path, trying to identify where things could have shifted. The distance was so short it made the case even more disturbing. Whoever approached Lena didn't need hours. They needed seconds. A runaway doesn't leave a half-finished mug. A runaway doesn't leave her bag, ID, or clothing behind. And a runaway doesn't abandon a life she fought so hard to build. Thorne knew this wasn't abandonment, it was interference. Thorne stepped outside the hospital's rear entrance just after reviewing Lena's clock-out time. The night air still carried a bite, the kind that sharpens your focus whether you want it to or not. He stood where she had stood, walked where she would have walked, and followed the short route toward the South Station lot. Even with the crowds of the day long gone, he could feel how exposed this stretch became at night. Long gaps between street lamps, blind corners, dark pockets where someone with the wrong intentions could wait without being noticed. He paused near the point where she would have crossed the service road. Tire marks, foot traffic patterns, a few discarded items blown in from the main street, but nothing that connected directly to her. Still, he kept scanning the ground as if he expected the truth to announce itself. It didn't. But something else did. A growing awareness that wherever Lena encountered whoever stopped her, it happened fast. As he traced the final steps to where she parked, frustration tightened in his chest. The area showed no signs of a struggle, no dropped belongings, no defensive marks on the pavement. Whoever intercepted her knew what they were doing. They created silence, not chaos. Back in his car, Thorne started forming the early outlines of possibilities: people who knew her routine, people who worked nearby, people who could move through the area unnoticed. He wasn't ready to point a finger, not yet, but a thin thread of suspicion began to tug at him. A sense that someone familiar to her surroundings played a role. Someone who could blend into the daily noise without raising questions. He didn't have a name, but he felt the presence of a shadow he couldn't yet define. Pressure settled on Thorne's shoulders long before anyone said it out loud. He felt it in the way Lena's mother clung to updates. He felt it in the way her co-workers hovered near the station phones. And he felt it most in the quiet hours of the night, when the timeline played through his mind on a loop with no pause button. A young woman had vanished on a walk that should have taken less than 3 minutes. 3 minutes that was all someone needed to change the course of her life. Thorne catalogued every person who might have crossed her path during that narrow window. Hospital staff still lingering after their shifts. Maintenance workers moving between buildings. Taxi drivers waiting for fares. Commuters heading home late. People who lived nearby. People who were always around, but rarely noticed. That last group bothered him the most, the ones who exist in the background until something forces you to look closer. He began interviewing residents from the surrounding blocks, listening carefully to tone, posture, inconsistencies. Most people were cooperative, concerned, shaken by the news. But there was one individual whose responses drew his attention for reasons he couldn't quite put into words. Nothing dramatic, no slip-ups, no visible nervousness. Just a certain calmness that didn't fit the gravity of the situation, a calmness that felt practiced. Thorne didn't jot the person's name down in bold or circle it aggressively. He simply underlined it once. A quiet mark, but significant. He wasn't ready to label anyone, especially without evidence, but something about that interview left a trace in his mind, like a voice whispering, "Come back to this." The case was still young, but the clock was already working against him. Every passing hour widened the distance between Lena's last step and the truth, and Thorne could feel someone watching the investigation develop someone who knew more than they were willing to say. The first time Detective Thorne met Victor Gentry, nothing about the man screamed danger. In fact, he almost seemed too willing to help. He walked up to the officers on the sidewalk before they even knocked on his door, introducing himself with a smile that felt rehearsed, as though he'd practiced it in the mirror before stepping outside. Some people approach out of genuine concern, others approach because staying silent makes them nervous. Thorne wasn't sure which category Gentry fell into. Gentry explained that he lived a few doors down from Lena and wanted to do his part. He claimed he saw officers gathering earlier and didn't want to waste their time by waiting to be called. It sounded considerate on the surface, but something about his eagerness didn't sit comfortably with Thorne. Most neighbors express worry or confusion before offering information. Gentry skipped straight to being useful. He spoke quickly, volunteering details. No one asked for what time he arrived home the night Lena disappeared, the route he usually took after work, even the brands of tools he kept in his garage. Thorne didn't interrupt, he simply watched him. The man's gestures were smooth, almost too smooth, and his answers came with a strange confidence, as if he had rehearsed those as well. When asked about his work, Gentry proudly described his job as an HVAC technician. He went on about tasks he handled, buildings he serviced, the hours he kept. It was thorough, but in a way that felt more polished than necessary. Thorne mentally noted every word, seeking the tiny cracks hidden beneath Gentry's composure. Nothing he said was incriminating, nothing was outright strange, and yet Thorne couldn't shake the feeling that Gentry had been preparing for this conversation long before it happened. Thorne had interviewed hundreds of neighbors in his career, and most of them kept their answers short, factual, hesitant, afraid of saying the wrong thing. Victor Gentry was the opposite. The moment Thorne closed his notebook after the initial questions, Gentry leaned in, as if he'd been waiting for a chance to share his own theories. Not the kind offered reluctantly, but the kind a person crafts piece by piece, repeating them long before anyone asks. He began explaining possibilities with a confidence that didn't match the uncertainty surrounding the case. Maybe Lena had been targeted by someone from the hospital. Maybe someone followed her home. Maybe someone mistook her for someone else. He listed each idea with an almost unsettling enthusiasm, as though he was narrating a story rather than talking about a missing woman. Thorne listened, but he didn't look convinced. Most neighbors offer theories to comfort themselves. Gentry's theories felt different, too clean, too organized, too polished, and the speed at which he presented them didn't help. It was as if he needed Thorne to hear these ideas before considering any others. The detective noticed the way Gentry watched his reactions closely, almost studying him. Thorne kept his tone steady, asking short, direct questions. "Did you hear anything unusual that night? Did you see Lena leave for work? Did you notice anyone lingering around the building?" Gentry answered quickly, confidently, but his eyes flicked away during the simplest questions. Thorne caught the shift, small but impossible to ignore. What bothered him most wasn't what Gentry said, but how effortlessly he directed the conversation. Like he wanted to guide Thorne's thoughts before the investigation even had time to breathe. By the time Thorne ended the interview, one thing was clear. Gentry had far too much to say for someone who supposedly knew so little. Thorne dug deeper into Gentry's background over the next several days, wanting to understand the man beyond his polished friendliness. On paper, Gentry looked ordinary. He worked as an HVAC technician for a mid-sized company, the kind of job that allowed him to move freely through buildings without attracting attention. His routes changed often. His hours shifted depending on service calls. He had access to keys, tools, and maintenance areas most people never thought twice about. It wasn't proof of anything, but it was the kind of occupation that could hide far more than a standard 9 to 5. When Thorne followed up with him again, Gentry greeted him as if they were old friends meeting for coffee. No tension, no hesitation, just that same warm, steady tone. It bothered Thorne more than open hostility ever could. At one point, Gentry even volunteered to take a polygraph, insisting he had nothing to hide. The test came back clean. Not a single spike significant enough to call deception. Most people would feel relief. Thorne didn't. If anything, the result clouded things even further. A man confident enough to pass a test meant to shake people rarely stood on solid innocence alone. It was during this period that Thorne caught a small shift, the tiniest detail, but enough to stiffen his spine. As he reviewed evidence from the area near Lena's car, a faint fiber was logged. No one knew what it meant yet. No one knew it would lead anywhere. But something inside Thorne reacted, the same way he reacted to Gentry's too smooth posture. This was the moment unease settled into the investigation like a silent warning. If a neighbor like this lived near you, you'd want warnings subscribe. Otherwise, drop a comment explaining why you'd rather not be warned. Thorne didn't voice his suspicions aloud, not to his team, not to Lena's family, not even in the privacy of his notes. But something about Gentry clung to his thoughts no matter how many times he stepped away from the case. It wasn't one moment or one statement that bothered him. It was the pattern. The friendliness that felt staged, the eagerness that bordered on rehearsed. The polished answers delivered with a calmness that didn't belong anywhere near a missing person investigation. Most neighbors showed signs of shock. Trembling voices, stiff posture, shifting eyes, that quiet dread slipping through their words. Gentry, however, held himself too steady, as if he rehearsed every movement before opening his door. Thorne replayed their conversations in his mind, analyzing each pause, each smile, each unnecessary explanation. More than anything, Thorne felt a disconnect, a space between Gentry's words and the emotion they were supposed to carry. Concern sounded hollow in his mouth. Sympathy felt surface level, like something he mimicked rather than lived. Thorne had seen that disconnect before in other cases, and it always raised the same question: is this a man helping or a man hiding? The fiber found near Lena's car nagged at him too. It wasn't significant enough to point anywhere yet, but in his gut, he felt its importance. Little things mattered. Thorne knew that better than anyone. He kept returning to the image of Gentry's calm expression during the polygraph, the way his breathing never faltered, the way his tone remained steady throughout. Innocence rarely sat that comfortably. As he drove home one night, the streetlights sliding across his windshield, Thorne finally admitted something to himself. He didn't trust Victor Gentry, not because of what he said, but because of what he avoided feeling. The call came in just after sunrise. A hiker, shaken and barely able to form a complete sentence, reported something deep inside Blue Hills Reservation. The dispatcher tried to calm him, but his voice kept cracking as he repeated the same phrase. "I think I found her. I think it's the missing nurse." Thorne drove with a heaviness in his chest that felt unfamiliar even for him. The closer he got to the reservation, the more the landscape shifted: fewer homes, fewer passing cars, more stretches of rough terrain that swallowed sound. This wasn't a place people stumbled into by accident. You had to know it. You had to choose it. And that fact alone sent a pulse of anger through him. Officers were already guiding the shaken hiker away from the trail entrance when Thorne arrived. Beyond them, narrow pathways cut through tall trees that blocked most of the morning light. Each step deeper into the woods made the air colder, the silence tighter. Crime scenes in places like this felt different not because of the surroundings, but because of the intention behind choosing them. When Thorne reached the clearing, he stopped. The body lay near a cluster of rocks, positioned carefully, not discarded. Her clothing was disturbed, but not in a way that suggested panic or rushing. It was the placement that hit him the hardest, as though the person responsible took their time, confident no one would discover her quickly. Officers stepped back as Thorne crouched, his jaw tightening. This wasn't an impulsive attack, this was controlled, calculated, and it confirmed everything he feared during the early days of the case. This wasn't the work of someone acting on sudden rage. It was someone who knew the land, knew the shadows, and knew exactly how to disappear into them. Thorne forced himself to slow down as he approached Lena's body, even though everything in him wanted to move faster, to pull answers straight out of the earth. The medical examiner knelt nearby, already beginning the initial assessment. His face carried that quiet, tense look that only appeared when the truth was too heavy to disguise. He gave Thorne a small nod, then spoke carefully. "There's head trauma. Significant." He paused, swallowing hard. More than one strike. The words pushed a wave of anger through Thorne. This wasn't a struggle gone wrong or a panicked reaction. These were deliberate blows. Someone had taken their time. Someone had ensured there was no chance for Lena to get back up. As Thorne stared at the ground beside her, he noticed there weren't many disturbed leaves or marks around the scene. Very little sign of movement. That meant she hadn't been attacked here. She had been brought here. The realization tightened his throat. Whoever did this didn't fear the dark. They didn't fear being caught. They operated with a chilling level of certainty, picking a place so isolated, so quiet, it practically guaranteed silence. As the examiner continued documenting injuries, Thorne stepped closer, focusing on Lena's right hand. Something faint caught his eye, a thread, thin and barely visible, stuck beneath one of her fingernails. He leaned in. The color stood out. A muted blue. Small enough to miss, but impossible to ignore once seen. He felt his heartbeat slow, sharpen. It was nothing on its own, but in his experience, the smallest things often carried the loudest truths. The examiner looked at him. "We'll test it, could be important." Thorne didn't answer. He already knew it would be. He just didn't know how important not yet. News of the discovery spread faster than Thorne could brace himself for. By the time he reached the trailhead again, Lena's parents had arrived. Her father stood rigid, fists clenched so tightly his knuckles looked bloodless. Her mother struggled to breathe, her body shaking as officers tried to shield her from what awaited deeper inside the woods. Thorne approached them slowly, each step heavier than the last. He didn't need to say the words. Her mother saw the answer in his eyes before he could speak. A sound escaped her, raw, broken, the kind that clings to everyone who hears it. Her father didn't cry. He just lowered his head, as if the ground itself had taken something from him. The pain radiating from them hit Thorne harder than any piece of evidence ever could. Cases like this weren't files, they weren't timelines, they were lives carved open with no way to stitch them back together. As officers formed a barrier to keep the family from seeing the clearing, Thorne stepped aside, trying to compose himself. He looked toward the entrance of the woods and felt a chill run through him. The path was narrow. The visibility was low. This place wasn't chosen randomly, it was chosen for secrecy. Someone familiar with the land knew exactly where to go to buy time to leave, time to clean up, time to vanish. This was now officially a homicide. There was no room left for speculation or hope that Lena had walked away. Someone struck her, transported her, and left her in a spot designed to delay discovery. The precision of it rang loud in Thorne's mind. As the medical team prepared for transport, he kept replaying one thought. Whoever brought her here didn't fear being caught. They feared being forgotten. And Thorne refused to let that happen. The crime scene team worked methodically, collecting every fragment of evidence they could find. Bags sealed. Photographs taken. Measurements logged. Yet Thorne's attention kept drifting back to that single blue fiber. It was unbelievably small, the kind of detail most people would dismiss as irrelevant. But the way it remained lodged beneath Lena's fingernail told a different story. It wasn't random. It was contact. A moment of resistance. A trace of whoever last touched her. He stood over the body bag before it was lifted, staring at the hand where the fiber had been collected. Something inside him shifted. This wasn't just another detail. It felt like a spark, faint, but burning with potential. He didn't know its origin, didn't know its meaning, but he knew enough to trust that the smallest trace often carried the answers bigger clues couldn't provide. This tiny fiber would later expose everything. The sentence echoed in his mind even then, long before he could prove it. As the team began their slow walk out of the woods, the weight of the location pressed on him. Blue Hills wasn't close to Lena's routine, not close to her home, not close to anywhere she would have willingly traveled. This meant the person who brought her here wanted distance, not just physical distance, but emotional distance. They wanted to remove her from everything familiar, to place her somewhere quiet enough that days could pass before anyone stumbled upon her. Once outside the wooded area, Thorne paused beside his car. Reporters were gathering. Officers whispered. The station phone lines would soon be overwhelmed, but none of that mattered to him in that moment. He looked down at the file in his hand, then back toward the trail. The missing person search had ended. The hunt for a killer had just begun. The months after Lena's death felt like a slow collapse. Leads that once looked promising fell apart. Tips dried up. The caseboard in Thorne's office turned into a map of frustration lines connecting nothing, photographs offering no new clues, timelines repeating the same empty patterns. Every morning he walked into the station hoping for movement, and every night he left with the same hollow feeling in his chest. He began the long process of revisiting every corner of Lena's life, starting where she spent most of her time, the hospital. He re-interviewed doctors, night nurses, volunteers, and janitorial staff. Some remembered her smile, some remembered how hard she worked, some remembered nothing at all from that night. But none of them remembered seeing anything unusual. No arguments, no suspicious figures, no one lingering near the back exit. Just routine quiet, predictable routine right up until the moment her path intersected with someone intent on taking her away. From there, he turned to the cleaning departments. They had access to every floor, every hallway, every locked room. If someone had watched Lena, this group would have noticed. But again, no one reported anything helpful. Thorne listened closely, searching for inconsistencies, but all he found were tired workers trying to recall events buried under years of repetition. What frustrated him most was the absence of witnesses around Lena's Ford Tempo. A car doesn't disappear without someone seeing something: headlights, movement, a silhouette, anything. But that night left nothing behind. No one remembered hearing an engine turning over. No one recalled someone else inside her car. No one saw the vehicle leaving the lot. That silence became the loudest part of the case. And every unanswered question made Thorne's determination grow harder, sharper even as hope started thinning around the edges. As the investigation dragged on, Thorne found himself returning to one name over and over again: Victor Gentry. Whenever new information failed to emerge, whenever another lead dissolved into nothing, Thorne circled back to the man whose calmness during the early days of the case still gnawed at him. He didn't have evidence. He didn't even have strong suspicion by procedural standards. But he had something that kept pulling him in Gentry's direction. A deep discomfort he could never shake. Over the years, he ran Gentry's employment history more times than he could count. He checked for complaints, disputes, unusual schedule changes, sudden relocations. He re-interviewed neighbors, hoping someone remembered something new. A new noise. A strange sight. A fleeting moment they dismissed at the time but now might reinterpret. But every attempt dropped them right back into silence. Gentry himself never buckled. Each time Thorne knocked on his door, Gentry greeted him with the same polite manner, as if the investigation were nothing more than a routine disagreement between neighbors. He answered questions without hesitation, maintained his composure, and left no opening that Thorne could exploit. That consistency was infuriating. Real innocence comes with confusion, raw emotion, or frustration. Gentry showed none of it. Thorne started to doubt himself. He questioned whether he was fixated on the wrong man, whether he was letting instinct overshadow logic. But the feeling never left a cold certainty that Gentry knew more than he ever admitted. Yet the case gave him no path forward. Every document, every interview, every piece of early evidence hit the same wall. He kept searching anyway, driven by the simple truth that letting go would mean accepting failure. And Thorne refused to let Lena's story end in unfinished sentences. One of the hardest parts of watching the case stall was knowing exactly what tools Thorne didn't have. The early 90 seconds weren't kind to forensic work. DNA testing was slow, limited, and often unreliable with tiny samples. Fiber analysis was basic. Digital databases were small and incomplete. Everything relied heavily on eyewitness memory, which fades faster than anyone wants to believe. Every time Thorne pushed the lab for new angles, he heard the same answer: "We don't have the technology for that yet." The blue fiber, the one detail that kept whispering at the edges of the case, sat in an evidence envelope year after year, untouched beyond its initial classification. They couldn't trace it. They couldn't match it. They couldn't extract anything meaningful from it. It was like holding a key with no lock. Meanwhile, time kept moving. Witnesses moved away. Some changed phone numbers. A few passed on. Memories thinned out until they felt like fogged-up window shapes still visible, but no longer sharp enough to rely on. Every time Thorne tried to reconstruct the night Lena vanished, the gaps between facts felt wider. The lack of progress began to wear on him. He stopped sleeping properly. He stopped entertaining casual conversations at work. The case consumed him in ways he didn't admit to anyone, not even to his closest colleagues. They saw the strain in his eyes, the exhaustion in his posture, but Thorne brushed it off with the same line every time: "I'm fine. I just need one break." Years passed without that break. The timeline hardened into something cold and uncooperative, refusing to give up anything new. The hardest part was knowing Lena deserved more than dead ends, but all he could do was keep pushing through a landscape drained of leads. Still, he refused to walk away. By the time 15 years had passed, the case had etched itself into Thorne's body like a permanent weight. He carried it in his shoulders, in the way he paced the halls, in the way he stared at Lena's file whenever he walked by the cold case shelves. Younger detectives came and went, offering fresh eyes and new questions, but nothing shifted. Nothing broke free. The silence held steady, and Thorne felt himself aging inside that silence. His retirement paperwork sat on his desk for months. He signed it only after realizing he could no longer stare at the same unchanging evidence without feeling something inside him fray. The day he left the precinct, he paused in front of the cold case locker longer than anyone expected. He rested his hand on the metal door, as if touching it would somehow apologize for leaving the story unfinished. But even after stepping away from the force, he couldn't let go. He kept a copy of the case summary in his home office. He reviewed it late at night, when sleep wouldn't come. He wrote notes in the margins no one else would ever see. Every unanswered question chipped at him, but nothing cut deeper than the knowledge that someone who lived comfortably in the same city, had taken Lena's life and walked away free. He replayed interviews in his mind the way some people replay songs. He remembered voices, gestures, pauses, and the strange steadiness of one man in particular. Yet without proof, all of it remained trapped in his memory, circling itself until frustration replaced hope. Still, he held onto one belief: the evidence would speak someday. And the smallest detail, the one almost forgotten in an envelope, would eventually push the truth into the light. 25 years after Lena's death, a new wave of determination swept through the Boston Police Department. The city had changed: new leadership, new technology, new priorities, but some cases remained lodged in the department's conscience like unresolved wounds. Lena's file sat near the top of that list. It had gathered years of dust, yet the pain surrounding it never faded. That weight is what drew Detective Sergeant Moira Kelly to it the moment she stepped into her new role. Kelly was known for her sharp focus and refusal to accept unsolved as a final destination. She didn't care how cold a case was. She cared whether it deserved one more look, one more angle, one more attempt to drag the truth out of hiding. Lena's case hit her harder than most, not because of its age, but because of how brutally quiet it had become. She believed silence was often a sign that someone had buried answers well, not that answers didn't exist. When the department announced the formation of the Cold Case Tech Review Unit, Kelly immediately volunteered to lead the first sweep of old evidence. She wanted to start with files that had minimal movement, but clear promise cases where one overlooked detail might hold more value with modern science. Lena's case fit that description perfectly. As Kelly spread the contents across a long metal table, she saw what Thorne saw decades earlier: order, patience, and a handful of items that never found their meaning. But where he faced limits, she saw opportunity. Digital reconstruction tools, enhanced imaging, updated forensic protocols, all of it could breathe life into details long ignored. And sitting inside a clear envelope, small enough to miss unless you were looking for it, was the fiber that had taunted investigators for 2 decades. Kelly didn't hesitate. She pointed at it and said, "Start here." The Cold Case Tech Review Unit wasn't just another task force. It was a response to years of frustration, a team built specifically to hunt for answers buried in outdated evidence. When Kelly stepped into the new workspace for the first time, she paused, taking in the hum of high-resolution scanners, spectral cameras, and software that could analyze microscopic details in ways investigators, from the 90 seconds, never dreamed of. It was the complete opposite of the tools Thorne had relied on: faster, sharper, and far less forgiving of hidden truths. Kelly assembled a small team around her: analysts, forensic specialists, and 2 detectives who shared her belief that time doesn't weaken evidence, it only changes how you read it. They worked with a simple rule: old cases deserve new eyes. The team started reviewing priority files, filtering them through updated criteria. Cold cases with biological samples came first, then those with unidentified materials, then those with overlooked physical traces that could benefit from modern tech. Lena's case struck them immediately because of one detail: the untested fiber sealed inside a small evidence envelope, logged but never pushed farther. Kelly placed the envelope under the overhead light, her expression tightening as she studied it. "This should have been looked at again years ago," she said quietly. The team gathered around, leaning in. The fiber was small, almost weightless, but the idea that it might contain something meaningful electrified the room. To Kelly, this wasn't just a piece of old evidence. It represented a chance to break through the silence that had held the case captive for decades. A chance to challenge the assumptions that once limited the investigation. A chance to give Lena something she had been denied for far too long. Forward movement. And with that, the team prepared to do what no one before them could. The decision to send the fiber to a private lab came quickly. Kelly knew the department's equipment was strong, but she wanted the best specialists available, people who worked with microscopic materials every day and understood how to extract meaning from the faintest traces. The lab she selected had a reputation for cutting-edge spectral analysis, capable of identifying compounds invisible to older technology. Within days, the envelope containing Lena's blue fiber was transported under strict chain of custody protocols. When the lab received it, technicians viewed it under magnification so intense it revealed textures and dye patterns never noticed before. The team ran it through a series of spectral scans, breaking down the chemical composition layer by layer. Hours turned into days as each scan returned data more detailed than anything the original investigators in 1990 could have hoped for. Finally, one of the technicians called Kelly. She listened in silence as he explained what their analysis uncovered. The fiber contained a specific polymer blend, one not used in consumer clothing. It came from a commercial uniform fabric manufactured by a company called Alliance Wear. The technician paused before adding the part that sent chills down Kelly's spine. It was a dye used for only 3 years and only by one company. Kelly's heart pounded as she wrote down the dates: 1980, 7 to 1990, right in the era when Lena was taken. This wasn't a random thread anymore. It wasn't meaningless. It was a direct link to a specific supplier, a specific fabric, and a limited group of workers who wore uniforms during that short window. Kelly closed her notebook, her voice steady even as adrenaline surged through her. "Get me the distribution records," she said. "Every contract, every job site, every employer." The fiber had finally spoken, and it was pointing straight toward a very small pool of people. The moment Kelly received the lab's full report, the case shifted from possibility to direction. The polymer signature inside the fiber wasn't just unusual, it was exclusive. Alliance Wear had produced that specific blend for a short period, between 1988 and 1991, and every roll of fabric shipped out during those years was accounted for. This meant the fiber wasn't part of a widespread product. It came from a controlled supply, purchased by only a handful of companies across the region. Kelly stood in front of a large monitor in the tech room as distribution data loaded onto the screen. A list of contractors appeared, small in number, each with detailed purchasing logs, She scanned the list slowly, cross-referencing dates and order quantities. One name stood out almost immediately: Metro Service Repairs. Her pulse quickened. That was the same company Victor Gentry worked for in 1990, the same job he described casually decades earlier, the same uniform he wore during service calls. The realization struck hard. The blue fiber under Lena's fingernail wasn't just a random trace. It came from a uniform linked directly to Gentry's employer at the exact time of her death. Kelly didn't jump to conclusions. She knew better than to let excitement cloud logic. Instead, she cross-checked every other contractor on the list. Some operated miles away. Others dissolved in the early 90 seconds. None had employees living near Lena. None performed regular work near her hospital or her neighborhood. The net was shrinking fast, and every data point pointed in one direction. Still, a question hovered in the air like a challenge. Was the fiber enough? Some investigators would say yes. Others would call it thin. Kelly wasn't interested in opinions, she wanted confirmation. And that meant one thing: she needed to speak to Gentry again. Kelly didn't approach the follow-up interview with Gentry impulsively. She prepared for it the way a surgeon prepares for a critical operation: steady hands, clear focus, and no wasted movement. She reviewed every statement he'd ever given, his casual explanations, his polished tone, his rehearsed calm. Then she compared those statements to the newly uncovered data linking the fiber to his company's uniforms. The contrast sharpened the edges of her suspicion. Before visiting him, she ran a background sweep again, not because she expected new information, but because she wanted to walk into the conversation knowing more about him than he assumed she did. His records were clean, his work history stable. His neighbors described him as quiet, helpful, and dependable. On paper, he looked harmless, the kind of man who never made noise in a community. But Kelly had seen that profile before. Sometimes the quiet ones simply spent years perfecting their mask. She arrived at his house late in the afternoon. The neighborhood was calm, the kind of place where strangers stood out. Gentry opened the door within seconds of her knocking, smiling with the same controlled warmth he'd shown Thorne. "Detective Kelly," he said, as though her visit was expected. "Come in. I always try to help." She stepped across the threshold, studying him the way Thorne once did. His posture was relaxed, his voice steady, his breathing even. Too even. Most people tensed up the moment detectives revisited them about an old case, but Gentry looked like he had practiced serenity for years. Kelly began with simple questions: his memories of 1990, his typical work schedule, his routes. He answered smoothly, as though the past was a script he had memorized long ago. But when she mentioned Metro Service Repairs and the uniforms manufactured between 1988 and 1991, she caught something. Not a flinch. Not fear. Just the smallest pause, a single beat of silence where there shouldn't have been one. Kelly didn't miss that pause. It was small enough that most detectives wouldn't have caught it, but she saw the shift in his eyes, a quick calculation, a silent adjustment, a moment where his mind raced ahead of his expression. Gentry recovered fast, smiling politely as if nothing had changed. But Kelly leaned back in her seat, letting the silence sit for a moment longer than comfort allowed. For the first time since arriving, she saw a crack. A hairline fracture, but a crack nonetheless. "Those uniforms," Kelly continued, her tone calm but deliberate, "were produced for a very limited time. Only a few companies received shipments. Yours was one of them." Gentry nodded, his expression still smooth. "Yes, we had those. But that was decades ago. You can't seriously think a scrap from one of those shirts means anything now." His voice didn't rise. His breathing didn't change. He didn't show anger or fear or frustration. He showed nothing. That emptiness, that unnatural steadiness, pushed Kelly's instincts into sharper territory. Most innocent men respond with confusion or irritation when confronted with specific evidence. Gentry responded the way a man responds when he's spent years preparing for this moment. She shifted forward. Someone wearing a uniform like that made contact with Lena on the night she disappeared, contact close enough for her to fight back. Another pause, shorter this time, but present. Kelly watched him carefully. Was the fiber enough to arrest him? No. Not yet. Was it enough to change the direction of the investigation? Absolutely. This was the moment that split viewers into two camps. Some say this evidence is enough, others say it's too thin. So Kelly pressed him harder, not for confession but for the reaction he couldn't completely hide. "Where do you stand?" she asked quietly. When Kelly walked out of Gentry's house, the sun was already dropping behind the rooftops, stretching the street into long strips of fading light. She didn't rush to her car. She stood still for a moment, replaying every second of the conversation, his tone, his posture. The tiny pauses he tried to bury. She had spoken to dozens of people linked to old cases, and most carried the weight of time in their voices, faded memories, uncertainty, regret. Gentry carried none of that. He behaved like a man rehearsing lines he had perfected for decades. But even with that unshakable instinct, she had to face a harsh truth. The fiber was powerful but still circumstantial. It connected his workplace to the era of the crime. It connected his uniform to the trace found under Lena's fingernail. It suggested contact but didn't prove it. Not in a courtroom. Not in a way that could survive scrutiny. Kelly returned to the office that evening and spread the evidence across her desk again, studying it piece by piece. The uniform connection, the limited production window, Gentry's employment records, his proximity to Lena's home, his overly prepared demeanor. All arrows pointed in one direction, yet the law demanded more than direction. It demanded impact, clarity, something irrefutable. She stared at the fiber envelope, the faint blue thread resting against clear plastic. It had survived 25 years, untouched, unnoticed, waiting for technology to catch up. But even with its newly discovered significance, it couldn't close the case alone. Still, the path forward was becoming clearer. Kelly didn't need to force a breakthrough. She needed something small, one overlooked detail, one forgotten object, one trace left behind in a place no one thought to revisit. And deep inside the evidence room, that missing piece was already waiting for her, buried in a box no one had opened in years. The breakthrough that would change everything didn't come from a seasoned investigator or a high-tech device. It came from a trainee, someone so new to the job that most of the department barely knew his name. Omar Vance had been assigned what many considered busy work, reviewing old evidence boxes stored in the basement, cataloging items from stalled investigations, and confirming which materials could finally be archived. When he opened the dusty container from Lena's apartment, he didn't expect anything meaningful. Most of the items had already been examined decades earlier. Clothing, books, personal belongings, small furniture pieces, a few household tools placed in a separate tray. They were logged, photographed, and returned without further testing because nothing about them seemed relevant in 1990. But Vance didn't rush through the box. He took his time, lifting each object carefully, wiping off residue, and ensuring the new digital system recorded every detail. It was during this slow, deliberate process that he noticed something small, a faint mark on the top of a metal toolbox. Not rust, not dirt, something sharper. A thin scratch, almost too light to see, unless the angle of the overhead bulb hit it just right. He held the box closer, narrowing his eyes. There was a residue inside the groove, glossy, with a slight shimmer. He couldn't identify it, but he knew one thing. Scratches like this didn't just appear by accident. They came from contact. Something had struck the box, slid against it, and left a trace behind. Vance hesitated only a moment before tagging it for further testing. Most people would have dismissed it. He didn't. As he placed the toolbox on the lab cart, he muttered to himself, "If this means nothing, fine, but if it means something, someone needs to look." He had no idea how important that scratch would become. When the toolbox reached the forensic lab, no one expected anything remarkable. It was logged as a standard household item, the kind investigators usually eliminate early in a case. But once the technician placed it under the magnifier, the faint scratch caught light again, revealing the same glossy residue Vance had noticed. The lab team extracted a tiny sample from the groove, small enough to fit on the tip of a needle. Under higher magnification, the material's texture became clearer. It wasn't dust, and it wasn't metal from the toolbox. It was a lacquer, smooth, hardened, and oddly tinted. The technician frowned, recognizing the telltale shine of a finish designed for something decorative, not industrial. They ran it through a chemical comparison, first against common sources, furniture coatings, paint fragments, nail polish. Nothing matched. Then, one of the analysts remembered the list of missing items from Lena's apartment. Her nurses watched the one with the indigo faceplate she wore every shift and was never recovered. With that in mind, they pulled up the reference catalog for watch materials from the late 82nds and early 92nds. There it was an exact match. The lacquer belonged to an indigo coating used on a small batch of nurse watches manufactured during Lena's training years. The lab fell silent as the technician confirmed the result. This wasn't household residue. This wasn't contamination. This was the faceplate coating from Lena's missing watch. Kelly arrived minutes later, summoned without explanation. When she looked at the magnified sample and the report beside it, she felt the air shift. The watch hadn't simply disappeared, it had struck the toolbox inside Lena's own apartment. Someone had been in her home during the crime, and they brought the watch with them. Kelly stood over the report, rereading the confirmation again and again, forcing herself to slow down even as adrenaline pushed her pulse faster. The lacquer came from Lena's missing nurse's watch. The scratch came from contact inside the apartment. That single impact, brief, accidental, unnoticed for decades, revealed something no witness, timeline, or interview ever had. The person who put that scratch on the toolbox stood inside Lena's apartment during the crime. That meant the killer didn't intercept her outside and flee. They entered her home. They carried her watch with them. They made contact with an object she owned. Kelly felt the room tilt slightly as the walls between possibility and certainty narrowed. This wasn't circumstantial anymore. This wasn't a vague connection or a guess. This was physical proof, a trace tying the killer to the one place he should never have been. She pulled up the apartment inventory list from 1,990. Thorne had logged the toolbox as part of Lena's belongings. She pictured him standing in that same room decades earlier, staring at items that promised nothing. He couldn't have known the scratch mattered. He couldn't even test it with the technology they had then. But he'd preserved it anyway. And now, all these years later, that quiet act of thoroughness had become the turning point. Kelly's mind went immediately to the one man who claimed he had no connection to Lena beyond a neighbor's distance, the man whose uniform accounted for the blue fiber, the man whose calm never cracked, the man who insisted he had nothing to hide. Victor Gentry had been inside Lena's apartment, not as a neighbor, not as a visitor, as the person who took her life. And this nearly invisible scratch, forgotten by everyone for 25 years, had finally told the truth. Kelly didn't call the team together right away. She sat alone for a moment, staring at the toolbox, the report, and the tiny lacquer sample that had survived a quarter of a century. She could feel the gravity of what she held in her hands. This wasn't a clue, this was confirmation. The watch had struck the metal surface during a struggle. The killer had carried it. The killer had been inside Lena's home, and now the killer had a name. Every piece of evidence that once seemed fragile, the fiber, the timeline, the unexplained calm, snapped together with harsh clarity. There were no other suspects who wore that uniform, no co-workers with access to the same routes, no one else who lived steps from Lena's door in 1990, no one else with the opportunity, the proximity, and the unsettling composure that clung to every interview. It was Gentry. It had always been Gentry. Thorne's instincts had been right from the beginning. Kelly felt a sudden rush of anger, not just for Lena, but for the years stolen from everyone who had fought to keep this case alive. Thorne's sleepless nights. Lena's parents aging without answers. The community living beside a man who smiled through every question. That anger sharpened her resolve instead of clouding it. She stood up, breathing deeply, and called the team into the room. The moment they saw the report, the shift was immediate. The weight in the air changed. No one questioned the conclusion. No one hesitated. "Prepare the file," Kelly said. "This goes forward tonight." The turning point of 25 years had arrived. If you're staying with this investigation, hit subscribe so you're here when the truth breaks open. The final hunt was officially underway. The officers approached Gentry's quiet suburban home just after 7 a.m., moving with a calm precision that mirrored the seriousness of the moment. There were no sirens, no blaring lights, no crowd gathering outside, just a quiet street, a cold morning, and the weight of 25 years pressing down on every step. Kelly stood a few feet behind the lead officers, her jaw set, her eyes never leaving the front door. When they knocked, Gentry answered almost immediately, the same warm expression he used with investigators for decades. For a split second, he looked confused by the number of uniforms outside his home, but the confusion faded quickly, replaced by a familiar, unsettling steadiness. He didn't ask why they were there. He didn't demand answers. He simply nodded when informed he was under arrest for the murder of Lena Wexford. He offered his wrists without resistance. The lack of emotion, the ease with which he surrendered, sent a chill down Kelly's spine. It was as though he had rehearsed this moment too, the moment his mask finally fell away, yet he refused to let anyone see it crack. As he was escorted down the walkway, neighbors peeked through windows and half-open doors. Some gasped, some whispered, a few stepped back in shock. Gentry had lived on that street for years, mowing his lawn, waving to children, helping carry groceries for elderly residents. And now he was being taken away in cuffs, accused of a crime so brutal that many struggled to accept it. By the time the patrol car pulled away, the first wave of disbelief was already spreading through the neighborhood. The man they thought they knew, the quiet, helpful, dependable neighbor, had just been named a killer. And with that, the city's calm began to unravel. The news broke within an hour. A local reporter caught wind of the arrest after hearing police radios crackle with sudden activity, and within minutes, the headline hit every Boston feed. Arrest made in 1990 Wexford murder. Phones buzzed across the city. Morning commuters froze mid-step as push notifications flashed across their screens. For a moment, Boston felt suspended, caught between relief, shock, and a rising wave of disbelief. People who barely remembered the original case found themselves searching for details, while those who lived through it felt old fears resurface with stunning force. By noon, news vans lined the street outside Gentry's home. Cameras pointed at the house where he had lived peacefully for decades, capturing every inch of the property with an intensity that made longtime neighbors uneasy. Reporters interviewed residents who struggled to find the right words. Some insisted he always seemed polite. Others admitted they never felt entirely comfortable around him, though they couldn't explain why. But one question echoed through every interview. How well do you really know the people living near you? That question struck a nerve. It spread through social media, through conversations in grocery stores, through whispered discussions at office desks. People looked at their neighbors differently that day, a shared, uncomfortable awareness settling over entire communities. If Gentry could live quietly next door for decades, smiling and blending in, what did that say about the limits of what anyone truly sees? At the afternoon press briefing, journalists crowded shoulder to shoulder as Kelly stepped up to the microphone. She spoke calmly, and outlining the breakthrough that led to the arrest, avoiding sensational language even as the crowd buzzed with anticipation. Reporters fired questions faster than she could answer them, but her message remained steady. The case was no longer cold. The man responsible was finally in custody. Boston hadn't processed the impact yet, but the shockwaves had only just begun. The courthouse felt heavier than usual that morning. Word of the arrest spread so quickly that a small crowd gathered outside long before the transport van arrived. Some people held photos of Lena, others carried signs demanding justice after 25 years, and many simply stood in stunned silence, struggling to reconcile the calm face they'd seen on the news with the accusation now tied to his name. Inside, the tension sharpened the air. Court officers maintained their practiced composure, but even they exchanged glances that betrayed the weight of the moment. This wasn't just another case. This was the long-buried wound Boston had learned to live with. When Gentry was brought into the room, he walked with the same composed stride he'd shown during the arrest. No trembling, no outrage, no visible sign of fear. If anything, the blank calm on his face unsettled the spectators more than anger or denial ever could. The judge read the charge aloud. Murder in the first degree of Lena Wexford. A ripple of emotion shot through the room. Some gasped, some shook their heads, a few wiped away tears. Gentry didn't blink, he didn't shift, he didn't even glance at the crowd. He simply stared forward, as if this were a minor appointment he needed to get through before returning home. Kelly stood near the back of the courtroom, observing every tiny movement. She wasn't surprised by his control. She'd seen it in every interview over the years, but witnessing it under the weight of a murder charge sent a surge of frustration through her. It reinforced what she already knew. A man could hide in plain sight not by running, but by staying still. The judge ordered Gentry held without bail. The room exhaled a shaky collective breath. For the first time in decades, justice no longer felt distant. As news continued to spread, Boston's neighborhoods reacted with a mixture of disbelief and something closer to betrayal. People who had lived near Gentry for years replayed every small interaction they'd ever had with him, searching for signs they might have missed. Conversations broke out at grocery stores, bus stops, barbershops, everyone asking the same question. How could someone so ordinary carry something this heavy for so long? Former co-workers described him as quiet, punctual, and difficult to read. A few admitted he made them uneasy at times, but nothing that pointed to something this grave. One woman who lived down the hall from him for over a decade said she felt physically sick when his photo appeared on the evening news. "You never really know people," she whispered to reporters. "You think you do, until something like this happens." Parents held their children a little closer. Neighbors checked their locks twice. A man who once let Gentry repair his basement furnace stood outside his home that night, shaking his head, unable to reconcile the technician who made small talk about baseball with the violent act he was now accused of hiding for a quarter of a century. Radio stations opened their phone lines, and calls poured in for hours. Some callers vented anger, others expressed relief that the case was finally moving forward. And there were those who admitted something darker, a quiet fear that they could go years, maybe decades, without truly understanding the people living just a few steps away. Boston wasn't just reacting to a crime. It was confronting the unsettling idea that danger doesn't always arrive with noise or warning. Sometimes it lives next door, unnoticed, until the truth forces its way into the light. When the Wexford family stepped forward to make their first public statement, the air around the courthouse shifted. Cameras lowered slightly, reporters softened their voices, and even strangers on the sidewalk paused to watch. What stood before them wasn't simply a grieving family. It was a group of people who had carried an open wound for a quarter of a century. Lena's mother spoke first, gripping the podium with trembling hands. Her voice cracked on the very first sentence. She described years of unanswered questions, sleepless nights, and the constant ache of wondering where justice had gone. She didn't speak with anger, she spoke with exhaustion, the kind that settles deep into the bones after decades of waiting. Her father stepped forward next. His tone was steady, but his eyes revealed the toll time had taken. He talked about the promises he'd made to his daughter, promises that felt impossible to keep after she never came home. When he paused, searching for words, the silence that followed cut deeper than anything he could have said. Lena's younger brother, now a grown man who had spent more of his life without her than with her, addressed the city directly. He thanked the detectives who refused to stop digging, especially Thorne, whose commitment never faded even after retirement. Then he looked straight into the cameras and said something that left the crowd motionless. "We learned the hardest way possible that danger doesn't need attention to cause pain. It just needs a moment when no one is looking." The crowd listened without blinking. For the first time in years, the Wexford family felt a shift, not closure, but momentum. Boston felt it too. The city had carried this loss long enough. Now, at last, justice was moving. The courthouse steps were crowded again when the trial officially began, but the mood had shifted. This wasn't shock anymore, it was anticipation. After 25 years of unanswered questions, Boston wanted the truth laid out in full daylight. Inside the courtroom, every seat was filled. Reporters typed quietly. Family members sat in the front row, bracing themselves for the details they knew would reopen old injuries. The judge entered, and the room fell into a silence so sharp it felt like the walls were listening. Gentry was let in, once again wearing that flat expression that unsettled nearly everyone who saw it. No remorse. No surprise. Just a man whose secrets were finally being pulled into the open, whether he wanted them exposed or not. The prosecution began by laying out the case chronologically, calmly, methodically, but with a force that made every point land. They spoke about Lena's last shift at the hospital, her walk toward the parking garage, and the sudden break in her routine. They detailed the abandoned Ford Tempo, the wiped interior, and the strange absence of her nurse's watch. Each detail built on the last, tightening the atmosphere like a slow-turning vice. The jury listened with absolute focus. Some leaned forward slightly at the mention of the blue fiber, the thread that stayed quiet for decades, until the right technology finally gave it a voice. Others reacted visibly when the prosecutor explained Gentry's access to the uniform material through his employer. Every piece of the puzzle was being placed before them, not rushed, not exaggerated, simply revealed. As the morning session ended, the judge dismissed the court for a short recess. People stood slowly, as if afraid any sudden movement might disturb the fragile truth forming in front of them. When Detective Elias Thorne was called to the stand, something shifted in the courtroom. He wasn't just another witness, he was the man who had carried the weight of Lena's disappearance longer than anyone else in that room. As he raised his right hand, the Wexford family watched him with a mixture of gratitude and sorrow, aware of the years he had poured into a case that refused to break open. The prosecutor walked him through his early involvement, the abandoned car, the strange emptiness of Lena's apartment, and the gut instinct he couldn't shake about a man who always seemed too eager to be helpful. Thorne did not embellish a single detail. He spoke with quiet conviction, describing the long nights, the repeated interviews, and the frustration of hitting wall after wall in the early 90s. When asked why he kept returning to Gentry despite lacking solid proof, Thorne paused. His voice lowered slightly as he said, "Because some silences don't feel natural. Some people talk too much, and some talk just enough to make you wonder what they're hiding." A few jurors nodded subtly. He described the years after retirement, the way certain memories refused to fade. Files remained stacked in his home office long after he handed over his badge. He admitted he still reread them at times, hoping something new would stand out. Then came the moment the courtroom leaned in, the connection between Gentry's employer and the rare uniform polymer. It was the turning point Thorne never received during his active years. Though he wasn't the one who made the final discovery, the acknowledgement that his early suspicions were justified brought a flicker of emotion to his face. For the first time in the trial, Gentry shifted slightly in his seat. By the third day of testimony, the prosecution had built a framework that left little room for coincidence. They outlined Gentry's access to the facility where the uniforms were used. They highlighted the fiber's rarity, manufactured in a brief window, issued to only one local organization, and handled daily by someone in his role. The jury was then shown images of the lacquer transfer from the metal toolbox found among the stored apartment items. The chemical match to Lena's missing nurse's watch created a sharp intake of breath across the gallery. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't theatrical, it was science speaking plainly, a mark left where it shouldn't have been. The prosecutor connected each point carefully. Opportunity, he lived in the same building. Access, he worked with uniforms that shed the exact fiber found beneath her nail. Entry, the lacquer transfer indicated he had been inside Lena's apartment. Behavior, unsolicited opinions, unnecessary involvement, and an eagerness that felt forced. Aftermath, the sudden disposal of the watch, presumed destroyed. Gentry's defense argued that fibers transfer easily, that lacquer matches are rare but not definitive, and that proximity does not equal guilt. Yet each objection felt smaller than the last. Every explanation leaned on chance, too much chance. The prosecutor ended with a steady, unwavering statement. Some people hide truth by staying silent, others hide it by talking too much. But evidence doesn't bend for any man. It sits quietly until the right moment, and then it speaks. Those words lingered long after court adjourned for the day. The weight of 25 years now seemed to hover directly above the jury box. Days later, when the jury filed back into the courtroom, every movement felt amplified: the rustle of jackets, the scrape of a shoe, the thud of the judge's gavel. The foreperson stood, holding a slip of paper that carried the answer Boston had waited decades to hear. Guilty, first-degree murder. The room erupted not in cheers, but in a wave of emotional release. Some cried openly. Some closed their eyes in relief. The Wexford family held on to each other, shoulders shaking, finally seeing the moment they feared might never arrive. Gentry stood motionless, the same expression he'd worn since the day of his arrest. No anger, no plea, no shock. Just that same unsettling calm. The prosecution moved to sentencing swiftly. While discussing evidence, they highlighted one piece that would never be recovered: Lena's nurse's watch. Investigators believed he destroyed it shortly after the crime, eliminating the only item that would have tied him directly to her final moments. That detail, the destruction of something so personal, cut deeper than the rest. It wasn't just a clue lost. It was a symbol of the life he tried to erase. As the judge issued the sentence, the courtroom felt united in a rare way. This wasn't vengeance. It wasn't victory. It was relief mixed with grief, the kind that acknowledges justice while mourning the years stolen from everyone involved. Outside, the city reacted once again. People gathered near the courthouse, not in anger this time, but in quiet solidarity. After so long, the truth no longer felt distant. It was here. Complete. Irrefutable. When the courtroom finally emptied, and the crowds dispersed into the late afternoon light, a stillness remained. Not silent, just calmer than before. Cases like Lena's never end neatly. They leave questions that can't be answered, years that can't be returned, and wounds that heal unevenly. Yet something had shifted. The weight wasn't gone, but it was no longer growing. Detective Kelly stayed behind for a moment, standing in the empty hallway outside the courtroom. She thought about Thorne, the man who refused to walk away even when the world moved on. She thought about Lena's family, who carried pain without loud protest. And she thought about the single fiber that waited in storage for decades until the right hands uncovered its truth. This case wasn't just about a murder. It was about persistence. It was about small details that carry answers long after memories fade. And it was about the danger that can hide in the ordinary, the neighbor you never question, the coworker you barely notice, the stranger who blends into the rhythm of daily life. Boston learned something painful but essential. Familiarity doesn't equal safety. Silence doesn't equal innocence. And time doesn't erase truth, it just waits. As the Wexford family stepped out of the courthouse into the evening air, they weren't whole, but they were standing. And that mattered. Before this story closes, here's one last thought. If stories like this remind you how quickly life can change, stay with us. Subscribe so you're here when the next truth comes to light. And if you choose not to, that's okay, but join the comments and tell us what keeps you cautious. Your voice matters here. Because cases like this leave one lasting question. What other shadows still wait for the right light?